the amendment be agreed to. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, well, that was a bit of a woeful speech from David Cunliffe, wasn't it? I mean, the only half-decent line was one written by John Armstrong. It's a shame he didn't write the rest of the speech because it might have been vaguely interesting. And as for the label that he put on the budget, I hate to tell David Cunliffe the bad news, but that was actually the label that Rodney Hyde put on the 2002 budget. So if he'd stolen a few of the decent ideas from the ACT Party, he might have been able to give a half-decent speech, but he couldn't, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, but let's be honest, it is David Cunliffe. He's doing about as well for the Labor Party as Benji Marshall did for the Blues, Mr Speaker. He is the man who has about as many supporters in his caucus as Brendan Horan has in his. One. That is it. And here's the winner, because he's shaking his head over there. Grant Robertson. Good news, Grant. Good news, son. You are 127 days, 3 hours and 55 minutes away from being the leader of the Labor Party. Fantastic. No doubt Grant assisted David in the writing of that speech. You see, this is what's vaguely interesting at the moment. The Labor Party, and I kid you not, this is an absolutely true story, are out there polling. They are not polling on their policies. They don't have any. You can see that from the speech. They are truthfully out there asking this question: is Shane Jones going to be missed from the Labor Party? Well, here's a tip. Yes, actually. Because he's the only guy who believes in economic development. And to quote Shane, why would he want to hang around and be Economic Development Minister in a government that doesn't believe in economic development? Mr Speaker, this was a very, very good budget by Bill English. A very good budget. And Mr Speaker, it reflects 6 years of hard work by the government, but by businesses and by New Zealanders from one end of the country to the other, Mr Speaker. It was a confident budget for a confident nation. It is a nation where overwhelmingly, across New Zealand, the majority of New Zealanders believe this country is heading in the right direction, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, it's a budget that sees the books back in surplus, growth at 4%, wages rising faster than inflation, more money in this budget for families, for businesses and for the most vulnerable. It is a budget focused on growth, jobs and prosperity. Mr Speaker, it is a budget that looks to restore the core finances of New Zealand. It is a budget, like this government, focused on the issues that matter. Mr Speaker, it is a budget that New Zealanders will recognise that this is a great country, a great place to raise a family, and a government that's committed to doing everything it can to make that situation even better. Mr Speaker, this was Bill English's 6th budget, and as he pointed out yesterday, he's had as many budgets as he's had children, which is living proof, I think, and you, I'm sure, will agree with me, Mr Speaker, living proof of why you should have a Catholic Minister of Finance, Mr Speaker. But what should we contrast this budget with? I know. Let's contrast it with Labor's alternative, because David Cunliffe read out Labor's alternative on Monday. Now, in fairness, it wasn't really a budget, it was a wish list. It was mercilessly brief, but it went a little bit like this. Nope. Dear Santa, please Santa, could you bring me 4% unemployment and whopping big future surpluses? I've been a good boy, Santa, even if I won't tell Mummy and Daddy who the 2 secret donors to my trust were. Santa, I've tried really hard. Even if I did muck up the baby bonus and Shane Jones's departure and a few other things, I've been a really, really good boy. Love, David. P.S. Don't worry, I will let the reindeer sleighs go in the fast lane even though I've banned the trucks. Mr. Speaker, that was a summary of Labor's alternative budget. Actually, let's be honest, that was actually slightly longer than Labor's alternative budget, and more thoughtful. But the interesting thing, and I wrote it myself, unlike the Leader of the Opposition. Always a positive. But, Mr. Speaker, you see, this is the difference between a wish list and a budget. Because here's some interesting questions we might all like to answer. You see, did Labor support any of the savings that this government has made and ensured that this country came back to surplus in any of the previous 5 budgets? The answer to that is no, they did not. Mr. Speaker, did Labor support welfare reform that will see and has seen so many New Zealanders get back to work? No, they did not. Mr. Speaker, did Labor support tax changes to reduce tax rates paid by every single New Zealander across the country? No, they did not. Did Labor support a 90-day probationary period so small businesses can have the confidence to take on a worker? No, they did not. Mr. Speaker, did Labor support RMA reform so people can build houses faster and support the growth of businesses? No, they did not. Did Labor support housing accords so we can have special housing areas, Mr. Speaker? No, they did not. Of course, my favourite, did Labor support the making of the hobbits in New Zealand so 5,000 jobs could be created here? No, they did not. Did Labor support saving 3,000 jobs in Southland when it came to Tiwai Point? No, they did not. Did Labor support and do they support irrigations for our farms so that we can see a significant increase in GDP? Do they support oil and gas exploration? Do they support foreign investment or skilled migrants? Mr. Speaker, will they even support a free trade agreement with the largest economy in the world, the United States? No, they will not. And, Mr. Speaker, just before they get a bit starry-eyed about how it all was under Labor, let's just run through a bit of a checklist, because here's the facts of when they left office and what we inherited. 2008, this country was in recession. Now it's going to grow this year at 4%. Last 5 years of Labor, a 50% increase in government expenditure. We've got it under control. Mortgage rates for those homeowners that David Cunliffe was talking about, 10.9% under National, about 6%. Food prices, the thing that New Zealanders worry about, up 10.9% the last year under Labor, 1.5% under this government. House prices up 96% over the 9 years of Labor, up 28% under this government. Mr. Speaker, electricity prices up 72% under Labor, 20% under this government. The current account deficit, 7.9%, 3.4% under this government. And maybe, but maybe, Mr. Speaker, the most telling sign of all. Under the Labor government, 3,000 New Zealanders a month got up and packed their bags for Australia. And under this government, it's 350, the lowest since records began in 1986. Mr. Speaker, on Tuesday, Australia delivered a budget. So if you ever want to see what an experiment of a Labor Greens government looks like, it's called Australia. It's called Australia, and Tony Abbott's having to pick up the pieces. But here's what the pieces look like. It means less support for families. It means billions and billions less for education and health. It means a pension age of 70. It means higher tuition fees, higher fuel costs, increased doctors' charges, thousands less employed in the state sector. And despite all of that, Australia, over the next forecast period, will rack up $100 billion of debt at the same time that this national government will bank for New Zealanders surpluses $7.5 billion, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if we want to talk about the facts, I look forward to the debate about the facts because, Mr. Speaker, this is a very, very good budget. Its first focus is families. It's $500 million. It's free doctor's visits for under 13s, free prescriptions for under 13s. We're talking about 400,000 New Zealand children and their families having complete confidence to take their young one to the doctor anytime for free. National delivered that for New Zealand families, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, $171 million for paid parental leave, an affordable scheme expanded from 14 weeks to 18 weeks, far more flexible than what the stuff Sue Moroney was talking about. And, Mr. Speaker, for the many, and there are many that miss out, an extension of the parental tax credit from $150 a week to $220 a week, lasting 10 weeks, not 8 weeks, Mr. Speaker. An affordable package recognising that mothers want to stay home in those formative times with their youngsters, and they'll be supported by this government. Mr. Speaker, $155 million extra for early childhood education, $33 million for vulnerable children and 8 new children teams around the country. Mr. Speaker, the number one issue New Zealanders worry about is health. Well, this budget, on the back of the very fine work that Tony Ryall has done as Minister of Health, and won't he be missed as one of the great ministers of finance of this country, $15.6 billion, Mr. Speaker, but $112 million for the disability support services, $110 million for elective surgery. See, the difference between National and Labor, and we heard it from David Cunliffe, Labor know how to borrow and they know how to spend, but they don't know how to run things very well. So under this government, 40,000 extra elective surgical operations, Mr. Speaker, $20 million for rheumatic fever, $6.3 million for cochlear implants. Mr. Speaker, 20,000 New Zealanders a year are diagnosed with cancer. Under Labor, they go to Australia with the other 3,000 are leaving a month. Under National, they get the gold standard, 4 weeks or less. More money in this budget for cancer care, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, education. What's more important than education? $10 billion in this budget and $359 million to improve the professional standards of our principals and our teachers. Mr. Speaker, this is a government that's not afraid to measure, monitor and report on the progress of a child. This is a government that's not afraid to put $359 million into making sure that every child that stands in front of every student in a classroom is of excellence, and that's something to be celebrated and proud of. Mr. Speaker, welfare reform, what a tremendous job Paula Bennett's done. What a tremendous job she's done. Mr. Speaker, 1,500 people a week leaving from welfare to work in the last 12 months. 30,000 fewer children living in benefit-dependent homes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it was pretty predictable that David Cunliffe would get up and talk about income inequality. It suits his argument, but like the truth, it's not real. You see, well, you don't like it. You liked Brian Perry from MSD, who runs the most comprehensive study when you're in government, but when you're in opposition, you don't like it. And what Brian Perry's study shows is income has not become more unequal in the last decade. In fact, what it also shows is when we compare ourselves to our peers, to Australia, to the United Kingdom, to Canada, to the United States, all of those countries are more unequal. But let's also have a look at this situation, Mr. Speaker. Let's also look at this situation, because this budget continues to support the most vulnerable in New Zealand, working for families, accommodation supplements, income-related rents. But this is also what it shows, and this is an interesting point for New Zealanders. This shows this. The top 2% of taxpayers in New Zealand, Mr Speaker, pay 22% of all personal tax in this country. The top 12% of households in this country pay 76% of all net income tax before you even account for New Zealand super. Well, here's the question for Labor. If paying 76% of tax from 12% of those households is not enough, how much is enough? How much is enough, Mr Speaker? Mr Speaker, the budget does more for Christchurch, more for science and innovation, more for apprenticeships, more for transport, more for housing. It does a lot more in those very important issues. But, Mr Speaker, let me make this final point. This is a government, that's right, that's exactly what you'd say. You're an opposition worried about muckraking and trivia, and you haven't got a decent thing to say. You haven't got a decent thing to say about the economy. Well, guess what? I'm proud to lead a government that's issued and that's focused on the issues that matter to New Zealanders. The economy, law and order, health and education. That's what we do on this side of the House. We get the job done. And on that side of the House, Mr Speaker, they're worried about all sorts of things, but they're not the things that New Zealanders are in their homes are worried about. And how do we know that? Because the poll that was taken over the last 10 weeks saw Labor fall under 30%. Why? Because they're sick of hearing of trivia and muckraking. And you know what? David Cunliffe might have promoted Trevor Mallard back in the shop, and that'll lead them all the way to where it took Phil Goff, 27% or less, and he knows it, and David Sheeran knows it too. He knows it's the wrong way to go, because this government is going to keep talking about the issues that matter. This government is going to say to New Zealanders, there is a way forward that is progressive, is positive. It's about a future where we back New Zealanders to succeed. We back this country to go well. We back this country to be able to sell more to the world than we buy from the world. Mr Speaker, we are not threatened by being a multicultural society. We welcome foreign investment. There was a time when Labor used to welcome migrants. Now they stand on a farm with a New Zealand flag. Mr Speaker, this is a government that's focused on a New Zealand that's winning on the world stage. That's why we're becoming wealthier. That's why so many people want to come and live here. Mr Speaker, if David Cunliffe wants to keep talking, as the opposition do, about trivia and muckraking, we'll keep talking about the economy, law and order, health and education. We are a very lucky government to have Bill English delivering 6 magnificent budgets. It doesn't say it all today. We're in surplus. Australia's $50 billion in debt. More people want to live here than ever want to go and live in Australia. Mr Speaker, this is a government that's getting it right on behalf of New Zealanders.